Hello, and welcome to the next talk in the US West Coast series of talks in the 2021 set of Open UK Future Leaders training sessions. Please note this meeting is being recorded and will be made available soon afterwards on our YouTube channel. First, a little about the Open UK Future Leaders Group. Future Leaders Group is a collection of individuals who are interested in open technologies, including open source software, open hardware, and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding, and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and an in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. It operates under the direction of the Open UK Legal and Policy Committee and has a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technologies and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Grinnells, and I'm from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristows, and we're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just dipping in and out of our various projects, so please do get in contact if you'd like to get involved. And for today's session, we're pleased to be joined by Richard Fontana. Richard is senior commercial counsel at Red Hat. His work at Red Hat spans many aspects of software development, distribution and deployment, with a particular focus on open source related legal matters. He's a former board director of the Open Source Initiative and was the chair of the OSI's License Review Committee for several years. Fontana was previously senior director and associate general counsel for cloud and open source at Hewlett-Packard and counsel at the Software Freedom Law Center, where he worked on the drafting of the GPLv3 license family. As usual, we'll have a chance for any questions at the end, so please do pop them in the chat box and we'll invite you onto voice and video to ask them yourself if you'd like to at the end. Richard, welcome to our session today and thanks for joining us, and over to you to talk about the AGPL, network copyleft, and the cloud.
Thank you, Robert. So, the bio mentioned that I worked at the Software Freedom Law Center on the GPLv3 licenses. So that included AGPL version 3, which is one of the licenses in that family. So I have a kind of personal interest and connection to the topic of that license that some ways may exceed its actual significance otherwise. And the last time I gave a talk on AGPL was about 10 years ago, and it's continued to be a kind of important specialized topic in open source licensing. So I was happy to kind of revisit it when Amanda suggested the topic. So I'm going to spend a certain amount of time on the history because I think that's interesting and important to kind of understand what this comes out of. So, and especially people who kind of have been around this area, whether it's computing or software or open source, less than or sort of for a shorter amount of time than others who don't go back to the world before this century may not appreciate some of the circumstances that led to this kind of license. And I'll kind of assume that people have some understanding of open source licensing and the GPL, at least, maybe even the AGPL. So the thing to understand is that prior to the 21st century, the free software licenses, the term open source was coined in 1998, were kind of focused around distribution. So that by that I mean basically giving copies to third parties. The licenses were drafted to have their interesting requirements be triggered by distribution. You can kind of quarrel with that a little bit if you peer closely at the licenses, but that's basically what the assumption has been. And there's also been this kind of norm of sort of, in a sense, privacy built around free software and open source licensing, that internal use of software should be entirely unrestricted. And this is what's sometimes called freedom zero, because it's associated with the first or the zeroth freedom in the FSF's free software definition. And free software kind of gets started in the 1980s and 1990s in a world where computing had been shifting towards kind of a client-server model where you had relatively interesting software running on clients, And I think that kind of shaped some of the norms around open source and open source licenses, or what would be called open source licenses later on as well. And also the fact that business models were built around distributing restrictively licensed object code. So the traditional proprietary software business model, which emerged in the 1980s and became dominant in the 1990s, had a big effect, obviously, on both categories of free software licenses, permissive and copyleft. And the GPL's copyleft hack is oriented towards distribution. So it's designed to protect users by preventing distribution of closed source, binary only proprietary modifications. That's basically how the GPL works. And so that's how everything sort of was set up by the kind of late 90s. And somewhat sadly, the success of this commons that developed out of free software licensing and free software development led to some developments that actually undermined some of the basic goals of copyleft and the GPL. Basically, this is the emergence of web services and powerful server-side applications running using web technology, which by the late 1990s was becoming an increasingly dominant model. And so by that time, people started to worry about what they called at the time the ASP loophole. So this is an archaic term, but worth knowing. So ASP stood for application service provider. So there was an awareness that there were a growing number of companies that were providing services, basically over the network, over the web, primarily, and building their services on the back end using open source software. But because the licenses were distribution triggered, they were never distributing software, and so they didn't have. In the case of the GPL, at least, this was a concern because they had no obligation to share changes or improvements, or at least that was the assumption. And the example that by the kind of early 2000s was often, or mid 2000s was often given, of what the ASP loophole was is kind of helpful. So this is kind of a modern version of it, but people pointed to how there's this software GNU Units, which does conversions, measurement conversions, and Google, which was becoming a significant company during this time period, among other things, provided functionality in the Google web browser for providing unit conversion. And there was an assumption, which I think may actually not be correct, that Google was at one time using GNU Units on the back end. And so this was something that people pointed to as a kind of a very bad thing from a policy perspective, a GPL policy perspective, because what if Google made some significant bug fixes or functionality improvements to GNU Units on the back end, but never shared them with the community? So it's sort of a frustration of the whole purpose of the GPL. One thing I would mention is that this idea that there was a loophole is an assumption that not everyone agreed with. So there was always this kind of very much a minority view that you should interpret the GPL such that distribution should be understood to mean the delivery of web services. And there was at least one lawyer in Germany who claimed that this was a viable conclusion under German law. There's also a view that a little later on, when the model of server-side code coupled with pushing kind of client-side code, typically JavaScript, to the browser, which is kind of a dominant kind of web application delivery model to this day, that in some circumstances could be considered one work for GPL purposes, so that if you push GPL licensed JavaScript code to the browser, that triggers an obligation to share your changes on the server side. That is a view that has not kind of prevailed, I think, for various reasons, but it was something that some people argued some years ago. So there were a bunch of attempts to address this ASP loophole beginning in the early 2000s. The AGPL grew out of a GPL community attempt to address it, but there were attempts outside of the Free Software Foundation's sphere of influence. And kind of interestingly, this is largely kind of forgotten, but was mostly associated with, bigger commercial companies or lawyers at those companies who I guess were interested in this issue or maybe interested in exploring business models that could be built around addressing this supposed copyleft loophole. So the OSI has actually approved a bunch of licenses that address copyleft in a network services context. Most of those licenses are not well known or are entirely extinct. And by the way, I use the term network copyleft in the title. That's not a standard term for this whole category, but it's something that's been used recently. I think the lawyer Kyle Mitchell has popularized it to some degree, and I think it's a useful term to use to describe this category of copyleft licenses that reach beyond distribution to try to extend a copyleft policy to that'll be triggered by providing network services, whether it's web services or other network services. So in some ways, these other licenses were actually broader than the AGPL, and they typically implemented, or at least some of them implemented the network copyleft by redefining distribution to include what some licenses called external deployment. So the effort around the certain people who were closely associated with the Free Software Foundation. So and this is sort of a more idealistic, social policy oriented or software freedom oriented group of people. The license that grew out of that group was the Affero GPL, and there was an initial version of the Affero GPL developed by Henry Poole of a company at that time called Affero, which is a mispronunciation of a Latin verb that I think can be translated as contribute. He got the FSF to authorize a fork of GPL version 2 that tried to address this network services loophole, and the idea was to require the user to preserve a download source feature, so a button in the web interface or what have you, and if the user modified the software, the download source button would have to provide, when selected by the ultimate end user, would have to provide the corresponding source code of the modified version. This was a license that was somewhat controversial among its very target group, because it relied on restrictions on modification. It also had some features that were pretty criticized among that group. So these were people in the technical community who were otherwise going to be inclined to be sympathetic to the concern about the network services loophole in the GPL, but who saw some policy problems or textual problems in the license itself. And so it was not widely used, but many people expected the FSF to incorporate it into GPL version 3, which the FSF started to talk about in the early 2000s as being an imminent revision to the GPL, which the previous version, GPL version 2, had been published in 1991. And that actually did not happen. So the early public drafts of GPL version 3 instead had a kind of compatibility provision, which basically said that you could have licenses with AGPL style provisions, and those would be compatible with GPL version 3. So that surprised and disappointed some people who were concerned about this services copyleft loophole problem, which was a growing number of people by this time, the mid 2000s. And GPL version 3 makes clear that it doesn't, normally doesn't reach providing the software through a service. So it has this term convey, which is basically a kind of reformulation of the notion of distribution, and the license makes clear that it doesn't apply to mere interaction over a network. Okay, so I was actually involved in the events that led to the development of an AGPL version 3. So this was a compromise. Some people, some stakeholders, if you will, on the commercial side complained that the GPLv3 approach, the draft approach, having a compatibility provision would just lead to a proliferation of all sorts of Pharaoh-style licenses, that would be sort of bad. The growing number of, typically younger network freedom advocates were very disappointed that the GPLv3 didn't address this issue directly. They also, were critics of the original AGPL language. So I suggested, and I was a lawyer, outside counsel for the Free Software Foundation at this time. I suggested that we have an FSF endorsed single Pharaoh license that would be compatible with GPL version 3, and that would address the perceived deficiencies of the original AGPL. So this is the relevant provision. It's one section of AGPL version 3, which ended up being released in 2007 along with GPL version 3. It was approved by the Open Source Initiative as an open source license in early 2008. And basically, it's written in a way that's more flexible than the original AGPL. So it is triggered by modification. I'll talk about that more in a moment. It says if you modify the program, your modified version must prominently offer users interacting with it remotely through a computer network an opportunity to receive the corresponding source. And it says by providing the corresponding source at no charge through some standard or customary means of facilitating copying of software. And that language about standard or customary means, that was designed to address the rigidity of the original AGPL, which was highly specific about how you couldn't alter a download source button or download source link, and you had to use a certain network protocol, HTTP, for providing source code, which was widely criticized among the kind of the target interest group. So by this time, we're in 2008. The developments that people had been concerned about at the turn of the century were only getting more more acute. So we had web applications that were at least as powerful as traditional locally executed software. There's essentially a big shift in how computing was done, where much of the interesting work in computing now was taking place on the server side. The browser, whether it's on a laptop or a smartphone app, kind of alternative to a browser, became a kind of thin client for delivery of applications. And this is around the time period people start talking about software as a service and also cloud computing in the modern sense. And by the way, there's a kind of confusing thing here about what cloud even means. So cloud is sometimes used, and it started to be used around this time period, to mean basically as a synonym of software as a service. But this is also the time period when Amazon Web Services gets started, and this notion of cloud computing referring to a kind of utility style of computing also becomes prevalent. And the two are closely related, but you can have software as a service without having cloud computing in that sense. And cloud computing services in the AWS sense generally involves always involve some form of software as a service. So the two concepts are intertwined, but they get kind of mixed up, and they were sort of mixed up around this time period, and that led to a certain degree of confusion that I recall. So there was and a lot. Also, what happened during this period is that there was growing concern about centralization of some of the increasingly big providers of these important services. So around this time, there was a sort of movement to sometimes called the fediverse to promote federated network services as an alternative to centralized proprietary services. There was something called the Franklin Street Statement, which promoted this idea, and part of it was encouraging the use of AGPL, but it was a broader vision than that. But this didn't really attract that much support. So that's kind of the early history that I wanted to spend some time on. And so we had about 10 years of experience of AGPLv3 from 2008 to 2018, and I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the adoption of AGPLv3 and non-adoption and some of the interpretive issues that have come up. So, AGPLv3 is certainly not that widely adopted compared to GPLv3 and certainly compared to GPLv2. But on the other hand, it's the only network copyleft license that's ever seen any significant adoption, I would argue. So it's significant for that reason. And it has a kind of importance in open source licensing for that reason, and because it's part of the FSF stewarded suite of GPL family licenses. That sort of gives it an inherent importance that it otherwise might not have, and has certainly been one of the main factors that has led to its adoption at all. There's certainly been plenty of community projects and corporate projects that have adopted the license over the years, and I'm using community to mean projects that don't necessarily have a single vendor behind them, that aren't using the AGPL for some sort of business model, essentially kind of proprietary licensing oriented purpose, which is usually the reason why it gets selected on the corporate side as a kind of big generalization. So we see these two different uses of the license, which we also see in the GPL world, but one of the big differences is that the proportions of those two different uses, the community use and the corporate use, for lack of better terms, is quite different. That the corporate use of AGPL is a much bigger share than this is kind of a bad term. By corporate, I mean kind of what's sometimes referred to as the dual licensing or proprietary relicensing business model, in which you release a copyleft version of a program for the community, and then you have sometimes a more feature enhanced proprietary license version that you sell for license fees or for subscription fees and so forth. And that's the distinction I'm making. So many people have kind of talked about the adoption of AGPLv3 as being primarily about lack of adoption. Increasingly, or at least some people kind of describe this as a sort of tragic thing that didn't have to happen, and that certain events sort of went wrong that led to this relative lack of adoption of the license. And I think that's an interesting topic. This is part of a broader sort of issue or topic that many have talked about over the past 10 years, about the sort of purported decline of the GPL and copyleft licenses generally. So some people have pointed to the fact that the Free Software Foundation, as the steward of the license, never really evangelized the license. And that's kind of true for a complicated series of reasons. One of them is that Richard Stallman, who had been had been the obviously the founder of the Free Software Foundation and president of the FSF for most of this period, was never really interested in the license, frankly. It was something that was sort of promoted by people around the FSF staff members, people close to Richard Stallman, but Richard Stallman himself was never really that concerned about the whole policy problem, in part because he didn't really use web technology himself for various reasons. And related to this is that there's this view that there are some interpretive challenges in AGPL, and that the FSF never really got too involved in providing guidance on how to address these interpretive issues. Whereas with the GPL, the FSF played an important role over many years in trying to provide guidance on how to interpret the license. And so projects using the license and users dealing with software under the license were kind of left to their own devices, in a sense, without any kind of guidance from the license steward. I think also that this dominant use of the license by the dual licensing business model companies may have had an effect on adoption. So the fact that the license was so often used not by the community, not by community projects, but by these dual license projects, where the whole point of picking the license was that it was sort of the scariest license imaginable, may have led to a kind of damage to the reputation of the license on the community side. It's hard to kind of demonstrate that, but I think that may have been the case. And then on the developer side, I think that there really wasn't that much interest in the kind of policy concerns of the that you see behind the AGPL and the Franklin Street statement that I mentioned. Also, some developers were probably concerned about the hostility of potential employers, so they wouldn't want to kind of start projects and put them under the AGPL because they might be concerned that, well, their employer wouldn't let them work on those projects if they got a job at that employer. Some employers had anti-AGPL policies. And there was sort of a trend of developers putting tools and libraries under permissive licenses in this time period, and this is kind of like leading up to the present day, but keeping web applications proprietary. So they would sort of build a business around proprietary web applications. They would open source portions of that technology, but not the secret sauce, if you will. GitHub may be a kind of famous example of this. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these interpretive issues at the risk of getting a little bit too much into the weeds. And I think AGPL has been scrutinized, in a sense, unfairly compared to other open source licenses. You can find fault with any widely used open source license, whether it's the Apache license or the MIT license or any of the Copyleft licenses. They're all, these form licenses that were drafted and then became these fixed resources that the community used, and that model is very powerful, but it also leads to certain challenges. You can't easily revise the license if a flaw is later or an interpretive ambiguity is later kind of highlighted, and that's just sort of a general kind of challenge of open source licenses. AGPL, because of its unique characteristics and because of its use unfortunately by some companies as a kind of scary license to drive sales of proprietary licenses, AGPL has been sort of more subject to this scrutiny than I think the other GPL family licenses or other open source licenses. So one issue was this modification trigger. So the AGPL seems to be limited to modification as to that network services copyleft provision, section 13, which sounds like it's a kind of nice thing from the point of view of a user who's concerned about, when do I know I need to start thinking about compliance? And I think that was actually the intention. So as someone who was involved in the drafting, I think there was an intention to have a kind of plain language understanding of modification of software be the trigger. So if you're just using upstream software without modification as a dependency, let's say, in a web application, you shouldn't have to worry about AGPL section 13 compliance. The problem is that AGPL and GPLv3 have a definition of modify, which was added to the license after the AGPL section 13 drafting was already stable. So this is a sort of subtle drafting history issue that I think is actually a little hard to prove these days, but led to this concern that AGPL section 13, when it refers to modify, is referring to something much broader, because the definition of modify is a fairly broad definition. And so one of the kind of issues that has come up, for example, is if you just change a configuration file, is that a modification? Well, I took the view early on when I was at Red Hat that that's not a modification. And actually, my view, more generally, is that you should not look to that definition of modify to understand when section 13 is triggered, because that isn't what the drafters intended. They intended rather to have the requirement be triggered by modify in a sort of more natural sense. So you actually go into the source code of the AGPL license code, you make changes, you rebuild, and you deploy that rebuild, that sort of substantive rebuild of the software. But AGPL averse employers and companies will point to this as an issue. Another issue is, who are the users that are interacting with the software, because that's also part of the trigger. So some companies have said, well, this could apply to entirely internal deployment of a web application. And I think that that's incorrect. The section refers to uses the term remotely, and I think that was intended to capture this idea that the trigger only occurs if you're deploying the software in a way that people outside of your organization are interacting with it. But nonetheless, this is something that AGPL critics have pointed to. And it gives you a sense of like why people have kind of picked, how people have kind of picked at the details of the language here. In a certain sense, like AGPL can't win because people are always constantly picking at some term or other in this one little section of the license, as sort of like a way of pointing out gotchas, if you will, of like, you know, look at this, this shows that you're going to have this unexpected situation where you're going to have to worry about compliance in some way that's entirely unpredictable. So another issue is how to provide the corresponding source. Now, as I mentioned, AGPLv3 was intended to be liberal compared to the much criticized AGPL version 1. And I think that's been kind of non-controversial in practice. So what I've actually noticed is that hosted instances of community AGPLv3 projects like, you know, StatusNet or now GNU Social or Mastodon or things like that, they typically will just comply with AGPL by having a link to a public GitHub repository or public Git server of some sort. And rather than sort of providing more detail than that. So they typically do not provide information on specific branches or tags. You could imagine a more strict interpretation of the requirement that might seem to require that. So that I think has been helpful in practice. This is something 10 years ago that I was worried a little bit about, but I think it's pretty clear that there's a relaxed view of how to comply with that requirement. The big one is perhaps this issue of copyleft scope. So people have argued that AGPL is problematic because the scope of the copyleft requirement, so basically how much of the software in your service stack do you actually have to provide to users in source code form? How much do you have to license under AGPL or an AGPL compatible license? This issue of scope, which also arises under a GPL, of course, in distribution, there's this view that this is inherently less clear or that it's potentially much broader somehow than the way it works under GPL. Some people have argued that, you know, with GPL, you can always take a binary and kind of work backwards from that to figure out how much source code you have to provide. But that because of the nature of deploying software as a service, it's harder to kind of do whatever the equivalent of that analysis would be. One well-known lawyer in this field that has talked about this issue has said, you know, all you have to do is really like look at your service stack and imagine that you're distributing that stack as though you were kind of like just shipping a binary, and then just do the analysis as if it were under the GPL, like what portion of that stack would be subject to the requirements of the GPL, what portion of it would be sort of an independent set of programs. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with the GPL has this notion of mere aggregation, which is also built into AGPL, that basically has states a limit on the scope of copyleft. It talks about how independent and separate programs are not subject to the copyleft requirement. And the traditional view under the GPL is that you can provide a stack of related programs that are nonetheless sort of separate and independent from a GPL copyleft perspective. So you can have GPL software, proprietary software, running as part of the same stack. And in fact, this is actually done all the time. And so the view is that this kind of analysis should also work under the AGPL. And I think that's a useful way of looking at the issue. And also related to this is that in the community especially, we've heard these calls all the time for a lesser AGPL, like the LGPL is to the ordinary GPL. So this idea that maybe there should be a license that is an alternative version of the AGPL that is explicitly more confined in the scope of its copyleft, the way the LGPL is with respect to the GPL. And so people have talked about this. No one has actually ever worked on this. One suggestion I've heard is to simply sort of specify specific interfaces as the boundaries of the copyleft requirement in the AGPL. But there's been a lot of talk about this, but no one's ever worked on this, perhaps in part because you'd have to kind of, there was an assumption at least that you have to get the Free Software Foundation behind any official LAGPL, and no one ever wanted to bother to attempt to get the FSF interested in that, and they probably would have been disinclined, at least at the highest level. They would have been disinclined to kind of work on that or endorse that activity. I would have assumed. Also, one of the few areas where the FSF has provided some guidance in its FAQ is that interacting remotely does not mean sort of connecting to software, let's say over SSH, a remote session, and sort of running software on infrastructure remotely. That I think has some implications for how AGPLv3 would work in a cloud infrastructure environment. So that's been somewhat helpful. Another issue that's come up, an interpretive issue, is what are the responsibilities for distributions like Debian, Fedora, Linux distributions that package upstream software, some of which will be under AGPL. So Linux distributions in practice today do have a small amount of AGPL licensed software that they package. So I think in Fedora it's maybe about 1% or so of the packages in the latest release. One issue that's come up is do the distributions have to do anything special to comply with AGPL? They're merely packaging and distributing the software. And I think the intuitive answer ought to be no, right? And that's my view. But the argument has been that if you read the text of Section 13 closely, it suggests that the distribution has to do something to make sure that the package as distributed has some sort of source code delivery functionality in it of some sort. And if this were actually the case, it would be highly burdensome and impractical for Linux distributions. And no distribution has done this, not Debian, not Fedora, not OpenSUSE, not Ubuntu. No distribution has done this because it's just entirely out of step with how the distributions package software. And nonetheless, this is a view that at least one community advocate of AGPL has I think, insisted on. So there's a difference of opinion here as to interpretation. There's been a small amount of litigation enforcement over AGPLv3, like far less so than GPL. Just in the past year, we learned about a case in Italy, which I think was actually the first case of litigation over a GPL family license. And there was actually a talk at FOSDEM earlier this year by Carlo Piana and other lawyers at his law firm on this issue, because his law firm represented the plaintiff in that case. And so I encourage everyone to check out that talk. Over in the US, there's a bunch of court cases over Neo4j, which at various points in time it's this commercial software that at various points in time has had community-facing versions under the AGPL, or in some cases AGPL plus some additional restrictions. And it's very, very complex, and I don't know all the details of that set of cases, and I think they're still possibly going on in some form today. However, there's no known case that raises interpretation issues that are unique to the AGPL, that, in other words, that don't arise under the ordinary GPL and that are sort of specific to AGPL Section 13. There's also been at least some community enforcement of AGPL. So Evan Prodromo, who was one of the people who were behind the Franklin Street Statement back in 2008, and who at one time was like the leader in this sort of movement to provide federated AGPL licensed decentralized alternatives to popular social networking applications. Evan has said in the past that he did enforcement on software that he maintained, StatusNet, which was sort of an alternative to Twitter or Facebook in some ways. Because I'd actually raised the point, is it actually difficult in practice to do enforcement on the community side, given that you're not, a user of AGPL licensed software is not going to be shipping or distributing the software in a context where Section 13 would be triggered. So how do you know when Section 13 is even violated if you're not seeing a binary. But Evan has actually pointed out that there are ways of doing this. There are ways of kind of designing the software that you can actually kind of check for compliance with the requirement. And so I take his word for that. Okay, so that was the middle part of the talk, and then I just want to bring the subject into the present day. There have been some interesting developments after 2018, and I think the reason why Amanda Brock sort of suggested this talk as an interesting and perhaps controversial talk is that AGPL has been in the news very recently. That's been, I think, a result of these recent developments. So how this got started. So if there was a kind of killer app for AGPL, it was MongoDB. So MongoDB was one of these corporate proprietary / copyleft dual licensing uses of AGPL that we saw after 2008, and probably became the most prominent prominent use of AGPL. In August 2018, MongoDB published this clarification, as they called it, of AGPL, basically saying that the way they interpreted it, Section 13 meant that your whole, if you were providing MongoDB as a service, your whole stack basically had to be what was subject to AGPL. So you had to provide the source code for your whole stack. And their view is that this was not an additional restriction. It was just a consequence of interpretation of what modify meant under AGPL Section 13. You can see how that might have developed because of those interpretive issues I talked about earlier. This was widely criticized by many people at the time as a form of overreaching. A few months later, MongoDB publishes a new license. It says it's relicensing MongoDB under a license called the server-side public license, which is based on GPLv3 as AGPLv3 is, but replaces AGPL Section 13 with a new Section 13 that basically implements this previous controversial clarification interpretation that many people had criticized. And the SSPL is part of a larger trend we've seen over past few years of companies that are sometimes thought of as open source companies, but typically have, what they have is a kind of open source licensed community version, and then a proprietary licensed enterprise version, and or a kind of cloud version that is different from the community version. So a larger trend of these companies moving from open source licenses to more restrictive source available licenses that are generally aimed at attacking the problem from their point of view of competition from cloud providers who are taking their software and sort of wrapping it in cloud services. Often Amazon is the target, but other cloud providers as well. And MongoDB argued that SSPL was different from these other efforts. It was just trying to update GPL copyleft to the cloud context in a way that AGPL had not, in their view, successfully done. So this is the relevant text of the SSPL, and basically what it says is that if you're providing the software as a service, and actually this is in some ways provides improvements over AGPL in terms of the effort to define what a service even is, but it says that you have to provide the service source code, and the service source code includes stuff like management software, backup software, all this stuff that from a AGPL traditional perspective, I would argue is mere aggregation and is outside the scope of the traditional GPL copyleft. And also that service source code has to entirely be under this one license, which at this time consisted of just MongoDB, right? So MongoDB submitted the license for OSI approval. I think they really thought that it qualified as an open source license. The reception was mostly hostile. The community reception of the license was fairly hostile. And MongoDB ended up withdrawing the license from consideration by the Open Source Initiative prior to the time when the OSI was scheduled to render a decision, which probably would have been a rejection. In my view, the main problems from a kind of open source norms perspective are first this idea that's related to that mere aggregation concept. So open source licenses are not supposed to have sort of unlimited copyleft scope. So there's this provision of the open source definition, section 9 or paragraph 9 that says the license must not restrict other software. And it's trying to get at this idea that open source licenses can't require all of the license, all of the software that you ship in your stack to be open source. And that's in a sense what SSPL tries to do. It says your entire stack has to be under SSPL. And that points to the other problem, which is that it's impossible to comply with the license because it's unrealistic to expect the entire stack components to be under this one license that wasn't even used prior to October 2018. Another thing that happened during this recent period was a new network copyleft license was approved by the OSI, the Cryptographic Autonomy license. So what's kind of interesting about this is that it, well, I guess one thing that's interesting about it is that it was approved by the OSI. It has an interesting sort of personal data portability provision, which is probably the most notable feature of the license. The fact that it's a network copyleft license is not that notable, but in some ways was designed as an improvement on AGPL. So far hasn't gotten much traction. And to bring things to the current year, so earlier this year, Elastic, which maintains a bunch of very popular projects, including Elasticsearch, announced that it was relicensing its projects from the Apache license to the SSPL. This was widely criticized. This is also part of this trend of those so-called open source companies moving to sort of non-open source available licenses in an effort to kind of prevent competition from cloud providers. So interestingly, a few months later, Grafana Labs, another company that's sort of in this general sort of space, says that it's relicensing its projects from the Apache license, but instead of going to the SSPL, which I think it probably considered doing, it decided to use the AGPL. And for Grafana Labs, the reason was they wanted to use an open source license, a license that was accepted by the community as meeting open source norms, instead of doing what MongoDB did and instead of doing what Elastic did. And I think to a large extent, Grafana Labs was praised for that action. I guess this month, Minio also was in the news as deciding to relicense its software under AGPLv3. Earlier, it had seen that it was going to kind of have an Apache/AGPL sort of open core model, but I think it's relicensed all of its software under AGPLv3, which is somewhat disappointing because I think it looks like they're kind of shifting to a conventional sort of dual licensing model. And I know some of the founders have been very kind of passionate in explaining why, in the past, in explaining why that model is problematic, which is something that I agree with. So if I'm right about that, that's I think a little bit disappointing. But nonetheless, it's sort of similar to Grafana Labs in picking an open source license rather than a license like SSPL, which is not consistent with open source community licensing norms. So I think that it looks to me like the general impact of those recent developments is that the AGPL is getting normalized. So the use of AGPL is actually not something that is scary, but rather AGPL is seen as a choice for companies that want to signal that they are good community actors and that you know maybe they have some goals of discouraging some uses of their software by cloud providers, but they're going to do so by working within the open source licensing system rather than by going outside of it by using one of these restrictive source available licenses. So the one other thing I wanted to mention is that also happening in this period is the governance crisis at the Free Software Foundation, which I think is going to shape how AGPL and other network copyleft licenses work going forward. So basically, it's kind of looking to me like the Free Software Foundation has lost its authority to in the community to sort of be an effective steward of the licenses in this family. So I don't know if we're going to be seeing future versions of the AGPL, and I don't know if we're going to be seeing any future guidance on how to interpret the existing version of the AGPL or the other licenses in the GPL family. And so the future of Copyleft may actually be outside of the hands of the Free Software Foundation. And that's going to be a big issue moving forward that we are going to have to deal with. All right, so that is it, and I hope there's some time for questions.
Thanks, Richard. That was really, really interesting and really, really useful. I'm sure there's some questions that'll come in. I don't think we've had any on the chat yet, but does anybody have anything they'd like to ask?
I guess I get to jump in because I know how to get in, whatever they're doing. Amazing talk, thank you. And I think that explanation of the issues with SSPL is a piece that's really been missing in the jigsaw, and something you definitely should be writing about, because I don't think people get it enough. And I've just had the challenge personally of trying to break down the 10 elements of the OSD to explain them to 11 to 15-year-olds in a course. And one of the most difficult to explain is this piece around not being able to require the whole stack to be open source, and putting that into a few words, making it succinct, making it clear is very, very difficult. And I have a sense that a lot of people do not get that as a specific definition in open source full stop. They don't really understand the parameter of that. I'd be really interested, Richard, if we don't see, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a personally held view of either of us, but it may be just the direction of traffic at the current moment in time. If we don't see the FSS as the steward for this, how and where is that going to be managed, do you think?
Yeah, that's a question that I've been thinking a lot about. That's a huge topic in itself, and I almost forgot to mention it, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about. Other people on my team at Red Hat have been thinking a lot about this. I think that we as a community we make use of these licenses. These licenses are, as we like to say at Red Hat, shared resources, a phrase that my colleague Scott Peterson has popularized. And we have this kind of tradition of relying on organizations to provide us with guidance on how to interpret the license. And it's looking like we can't really do that anymore. It was probably always problematic to rely on single organizations for that purpose. And I think we need to deal with this collectively. So we need to get together as a community and figure out how these shared resources ought to be interpreted by ourselves. And we can't expect to rely on these single kind of points of failure that we've been sort of assuming all along were always going to be trustworthy in perpetuity, and in fact, and which have played an important role in the past. But we saw with AGPL that the FSF didn't provide that interpretive guidance, and that led to some difficulties and challenges in interpretation, and at least if you have the kind of pro AGPL view, certain challenges in adoption or limitations on adoption. So we need to provide to come up with collective solutions, and I just think that involves coming together as a community and having discussions about and developing materials that will help the community in sort of how to interpret and comply with these licenses, including the AGPL.
And I know that you've been thinking an awful lot about cloud. You've written a book chapter for the book coming out in the autumn on law, policy, and practice. Where do you think that cloud space is going with the open source licensing issue? Is that a clear enough question?
Yeah, I mean, so this recent development of companies kind of going outside of open source licensing norms as we've traditionally understood them, and using these community-facing licenses or licenses for community-facing projects that may have some features in common with open source licenses, but are more restrictive in some way or other, like the SSPL, like these other source available licenses. That's been a consequence of developments in the cloud economy. I don't know if that's we're going to see more of that. So more companies of that sort adopting that sort of model for projects that have significance for cloud technology, like Elasticsearch, or like the projects associated with Grafana Labs, Grafana and so forth, Loki. These are projects that are of significance for cloud technology. Maybe we will see more of a trend towards either use of the source available licenses, or maybe more use of the AGPL for companies that decide to do what Grafana Labs has done and stay within the confines of the open source definition. I think overall we're going to continue to see cloud technology, open source, foundational projects do what they have been doing for the past 10 years or more, which is kind of focus more on permissive non-copyleft licensing. I think that trend is likely to continue, for example, for the kinds of projects we see in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation that provide so much of the shared infrastructure for modern day cloud technology.
I think you're right, and I think there's this real split between the foundational, the sort of non-differentiating, non-permanent collaborations that we see in the foundations across businesses, which work fine on the permissive licensing, versus people trying to create a business model, potentially on a single key package, where they are, I'm going to quote Shannon Williams here, one day they think they have a business and the next day they have a feature in the cloud. And it's a really interesting space, and I think it's more about the business model than the licensing, but it's doing a real disruptive job on open source licensing as it gets that business model sort of settled. There are 3 or 4 questions in the chat, and if they'd like to come on and just ask, Vicky Brasseur, do you want to ask Richard your question direct?
Oh, stop that grinning, Richard, dear. I'm not actually here to rock the boat, and I do need to drop off for another call. So timing, but I'm very interested in what you think this, you talked about shared resources and how these are shared resources and not relying on essentially a single point of failure to interpret these shared resources. Do you have, and I understand it would be a personal interpretation and vision of this, but what do you think that would even look like? Would it be a new institution? Would it be under OSI? Where would that go? How would that work? What would it look like? And answer quickly, because I have to go start another call soon.
Well, so OSI, I think Robert mentioned I was a board director of OSI for a while, as were you. I think OSI might be the right organization for this, although historically they've avoided taking part in license interpretation for deliberate reasons. But maybe in the future they ought to be taking on that kind of role. I think it has to be a kind of, from a kind of policy or political perspective, a diverse coalition of different groups. And I think OSI might be the right organization to play that sort of role. I'm not sure there's any other single community organization that exists today that could play that role. So maybe it's a new organization. Maybe it's something like the OSI.
Thanks, Vicky. Rowan Wilson, are you still with us? Would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to ask what your opinion is of, so rather than people drafting licenses which they don't really care are approved by the OSI or not, people who draft licenses which appear to be there to facilitate a particular business model, but who do seek to get them approved by the OSI in order to get the label open source. Do you consider that to be an acceptable, and these are specifically scary licenses where one may perceive them to be trying to chase people to take a proprietary license because they don't want to use this scary license? What's your opinion of that practice?
Yeah, so I wasn't clear, I don't think, in the talk that I have some strong views on that practice myself that are pretty negative. I think it's a kind of inappropriate use in many ways. Inappropriate use of copyleft licensing, at least from a kind of policy perspective. I think it's caused significant harm to open source licensing. So this very long-standing kind of tradition of companies using the GPL as a mechanism, a kind of business model mechanism to drive people towards purchasing proprietary licenses, and something, of course, as I was saying, we've seen in the AGPL space. I've also taken the view that I don't know if it's. I guess I've taken the view that it should be a relevant factor when thinking about a license that's been submitted for approval by the open source initiative as an open source license. So this was a concern I had about the cryptographic autonomy license when Van Lindbergh submitted it. It was a concern I had about SSPL when MongoDB submitted that license. I took the view that the business model or prospective business model of the organization submitting the license ought to be a factor, at least, in how you look at the sort of legitimacy of the license or how you understand the license. I don't know if that was a kind of popular view. I know many other people expressed an alternative view that this basically the business model should be irrelevant. That basically the issue is, does the license meet the open source definition or the norms underlying the open source definition, or does it not? I think at the very least, the business model should inform that question. And it kind of casts doubt on some of the justifications for the license. So some of the justifications that MongoDB gave for SSPL look a bit sort of questionable or hollow when you think about how they are using the license in practice. That's sort of what I mean. So I think it should at least be a factor in how you look at the question of conformance to the open source definition.
So we've got a couple of other questions still here. We've got Adam Tucker. Adam, are you still with us? So I'll just go back and see. Sami Atabani, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Sorry, while I figure out where I need to unmute myself. Hello, hi, Richard. I'm sorry I was late. I will certainly listen to the recording afterwards. Really interesting. I think it's something that we discussed here before in this forum. Very often, when licenses are used, they're used at a specific point in time. But as the technology advances and changes, that creates additional functionalities and interactions that may not have been clearly covered by the original license. Should we be looking at more regular frequency to update licenses to ensure that as technology evolves, the intentions remain clear?
Yeah, so I basically made this point a few years ago in some talks that I gave at the time, and that actually some talks that David Levine of Red Hat and I were giving at the time, that basically we should be thinking about more frequent updates of open source licenses, given that they are shared resources, as Scott Peterson likes to say. And I think we especially see this with AGPL, because something I didn't say is that AGPL, I think one of the problems of AGPL is that it was drafted a little bit too early. It was drafted as this technology was rapidly evolving, and we now we have a license that was from 2007, basically, based on a 2002 license that is applied to circumstances that didn't really exist the way we understand them today until after 2008. And so that has created some of these interpretive problems. And I think that some of that could have been addressed through updates to the license, things that couldn't have been anticipated. I think one of the problems also, frankly, is that those of us who worked on AGPLv3 back in 2007, we were not really experts on this technical area, even though some of us were technologists, like my friend Bradley Kuhn. We were not kind of engaging in the day-to-day sort of development and deployment of web applications at the time, and so there are issues that came up after the license was kind of used in the wild that we didn't have reason to think about, and people kind of reviewing the license when it was being drafted didn't really have that experience either, and so the license suffered from that lack of experience, and more frequent updates, which people have historically, I think, seen as a bad idea in open source licenses, but more frequent updates could help with that, I think. but that raises the problem that's become kind of very acute in the past few months, which is like, how can we have more frequent updates if we aren't even sure if we trust the license steward anymore? So that's just a fundamental problem that with the GPL license family now, as well as open source licenses in general.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the frequency is something that can be determined, and I agree with you. You don't want a license every year or every other year, but if you think back, 2007 was a long time ago already, and again, if you look at the sort of the cloud technology. If you look over the last 14 years, that certainly has advanced significantly since then. So even if those involved were the experts in the technology at the time, the advancement is just far more advanced that anybody could have anticipated. I think probably we're a bit more savvy today to anticipate the direction of travel in terms of technology, but with the best will, we can't cover every single scenario.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think one of the problems is that there's this strong view, at least in the GPL world, that the licenses should not be kind of technology specific. And I think that view has, in some ways, ironically, made the licenses a little bit too technology specific and too inflexible or somewhat challenging to kind of apply to changing technological circumstances. I think we see that most famously with the LGPL, but I think it's true of other licenses as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we've got a couple of other questions, but I think your questioners are a little bit shy. One was Adam Tucker, who may actually have gone, and he says, "Great talk, Richard. Do you consider that Elastic's intention with the new licensing approach is to prevent any SaaS-based use of its features, or just AWS-style Elastic as a service deployments which compete rather directly with it?" Did you get that? Quite nuanced.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to speculate on Elastic's motivations. I do think that and Elastic has another licensing model as well that it came out with, the Elastic license, which it updated also in the kind of January-February time period. I'm very skeptical about any use of the SSPL. I think it's essentially not possible to comply with, and so so I kind of view the license in just a fundamental way very, very skeptically for that reason.
Yeah, I'm sort of with you on that, and I think a lot of the FUD is the issue that we're facing at the moment. So there was one more here from somebody who wants to remain anonymous. Thanks, Richard, for your excellent talk. It's very similar. Do you think the corporate banning FUD around AGPL is justified or unreasonable? That's kind of a trick question for you in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not really a trick question. My organization, my company, Red Hat, is not one of those companies. We don't ban the AGPL. I know that there are companies, I guess, that do. The one that's sort of well known is Google, because Google has published some of its internal open source licensing policy documentation, and Google has all these justifications for why it does that, and it may be well justified in Google's case. Every company has to come up with its own policies around open source licenses. I think that I guess, as I was suggesting, I think there are these interpretive issues that have come up with AGPL, but I think that's a kind of a social phenomenon in a sense. I think AGPL became this license that everyone was scared of because there needed to be some license that filled that function, and unfortunately, AGPL was a casualty of that sort of social need. I have to kind of develop this idea further than I have, but I think AGPL has suffered from that, and also from the absence of guidance from the FSF. So with GPL, we had a lot of guidance from the FSF, and that got companies early on very comfortable or relatively comfortable with at least some uses of GPL licensed software. Because we didn't have the same sort of guidance from the license steward with the AGPL, we didn't have that reduction of discomfort. And I think that, I'd like to see more companies get comfortable with AGPL because it is a license that I believe meets, open source community norms. And an organization may not want to allow it for all scenarios or purposes, but it should be acceptable for at least some.
Well, I'll just sneak in a final little half question here. Ivo Emanuelov has asked quite a long question, but what it is doing is focusing on the fact that cloud is one of the bumps in the road, but there may be others, including things like AI, machine learning as we go. And he says, in the context of that, what is the maximum legally permissible scope of copyleft in the light of the attempts of the SSPL? Quite an esoteric and interesting question.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. It's kind of come up in the past few years because of this topic, because of things like the submission of SSPL and the CAL license also, both of them, kinds of network copyleft licenses. SSPL not being OSI approved, CAL being approved. The view has come up that I associate with Louis Villa in particular, that the OSI has been criticized for, in effect, saying that the GPL is as far as copyleft can possibly go, and sort of like, I guess the idea is that it is limiting experimentation or innovation in open source licensing by this sort of assumption that the maximum kind of innovation in copyleft, both in terms of that scope issue and other issues as well, has been what has done on the GPL license family side. As to this kind of question of scope, I am inclined to think that despite Lewis's criticism, I think that the GPL family has sort of surfaced this fundamental issue, and it is kind of even though we may not know the precise contours, it is a kind of settled issue that open source licenses have to have a limit in how far the copyleft can go. That's embodied in the OSD section 9. That's embodied in the GPL family with this mere aggregation concept. That's just a fixture of the landscape of the traditions. And that's one of the reasons why SSPL is not an open source license, because it violates that tradition without adequate justification. And I think that I don't believe that innovation should be frozen in licenses, not at all. I have actually criticized that idea in the past. I think we need experimentation in copyleft licensing, but I just personally don't think that a more extensive copyleft scope is an appropriate form of open source license innovation. I think that the limited scope of copyleft is a fundamental feature of what open source licensing is all about, and the coexistence on some level of proprietary and open source licensing is a fundamental feature of free and open source software licensing. We can argue about what the boundary should be, but I think SSPL goes way beyond what the appropriate boundary is.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you. There's a way in which you wouldn't have known that question couldn't have been better answered, in that next week we are going to be joined by Louis Villa, who is going to talk about his views on licensing and business models around open source. So really nice segue, Richard. That will lead the audience watching this on YouTube directly from one talk to the next. From my perspective, brilliant. Thank you very much. Didn't fail to meet what I was expecting, and I told you I was looking forward to this. I'm just going to hand back over to Robert, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Richard. It was really a pleasure to have you here, and thank you to everybody. And yes, see you on the next talk next week. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.